In the winter of 1889, Vincent van Gogh was confined to an asylum in Saint-Rémy. He had no access to the landscape outside, no models, and no color references. His brother Theo sent him a collection of black and white prints, reproductions of paintings by a French artist named Jean-François Millet. Van Gogh immediately picked up his brush. Working from those monochrome reproductions, Van Gogh produced 21 paintings. He had to invent every color himself. Millet's earthy scenes translated into Van Gogh's vivid blues, yellows, and swirling brush strokes. His brother Theo, an art dealer who had seen everything, called them perhaps the finest things Van Gogh had ever done. This video moves in two parts. First, Van Gogh, a painter who spent his entire career being shaped by one man he never met, and how that shaping gave him a voice nobody else had. Then, what happens to creative voice in a world where nothing shapes you deeply enough to leave a mark? Jean-François Millet was born in 1814 in Grouchy, a farming village in Normandy, into a peasant family who worked the land. He grew up doing field work himself, which gave him something almost no painter of his era had: direct, physical knowledge of the life he would spend his career depicting. Millet's paintings of peasants, stooped women gleaning leftover grain, a man sowing seed at dusk, laborers resting in a field, were met with suspicion by critics who saw political subversion in any sympathetic depiction of the working class. He was accused of socialism at a time when the accusation carried real consequences. Millet died in January 1875. 5 months later, 22-year-old Vincent van Gogh walked into a Paris auction house showing a collection of Millet's drawings. He wrote to Theo that evening that entering the room felt like standing on holy ground. He had found the artist who would shape everything that came after. Long before Van Gogh became a painter, he copied Millet. In 1881, before he had touched oil paint, he drew careful pencil copies of Millet's prints, working to understand how Millet had structured a figure, positioned a body against a field, made labor look like dignity rather than suffering. Millet gave Van Gogh a subject, the working body, the dignity of ordinary physical effort, and a structure for thinking about figures in landscape. The style arrived separately, slowly, through years of looking, translating, and making the same images over again, until something different came out the other side. When Van Gogh moved to Paris in 1886, he encountered the Impressionists, Monet, Seurat, Signac, and his palette exploded into color. The dark, earthen tones of his early peasant scenes were replaced by vivid, broken brushwork. He absorbed these new influences rapidly, without abandoning the older one underneath. In 1888, settled in Arles, Van Gogh painted The Sower again, his own version, a figure striding across a Provençal wheat field beneath a vast, blazing sun. He had first copied Millet's Sower in pencil 7 years earlier. Now it came back transformed. Same composition, entirely different light, unmistakably his own hand. In December 1888, after a mental breakdown and the episode involving his ear, Van Gogh entered the St. Paul Asylum in Saint-Rémy. Restricted to the grounds, unable to work outdoors in winter, he faced the loss of everything that normally fed his work: landscape, light, the visible world outside. When Theo sent the Millet prints, Van Gogh wrote back immediately. He had been growing flabby, he said, from never seeing anything artistic, and these prints revived him. That word, flabby, is precise. It names something specific about what happens to a person when the work they need to respond to goes missing. Van Gogh was specific about what he was doing with the Millet prints. He wrote to Theo that the process was closer to translation, carrying something into another language, the language of colors, improvising from the black and white impressions on the page. Every color decision was his. Only the composition came from Millet. The Asylum Millet paintings are among the most recognizable Van Goghs in existence. The color, the movement, the emotional weight are all his, even though the compositions are borrowed. Working from someone else's structure, he became more himself, more concentrated, more purely Van Gogh than at almost any other point in his career. Van Gogh left the asylum in May 1890, moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, and died 2 months later at 37. The last year of his life, the asylum paintings, the Millet translations, the final sprint of canvases at Auvers, remains one of the most concentrated bursts of individual creative voice in the history of painting. Van Gogh found his voice through sustained, deep exposure to one figure, a man he never met, whose work he copied in pencil before he could paint, and kept returning to for 15 years. The question his story raises is where that kind of shaping happens now, and whether it still can. Van Gogh needed Millet because Millet existed, a body of work serious enough, deep enough, to press against for 15 years and still find resistance. The question now is whether that kind of work is still being made at the same rate, or whether the pool of things deep enough to genuinely shape a person is quietly getting smaller. A voice doesn't come from consuming broadly. It comes from consuming deeply, sitting with something long enough that it changes how you see, then making work in response to it, then returning to it again years later and finding it still has things to teach. That cycle takes time the current creative environment rarely allows. Every generation of creative tools has promised to make creative work easier and better. The tools available now are the most powerful in history. What gets less attention is whether the volume of work with enough weight to shape someone for 15 years is keeping pace with those tools. Artistic production isn't neutral. It feeds the next generation of artists the way Millet fed Van Gogh. When the volume of serious, lasting work being made shrinks, so does the raw material available for the kind of influence that actually shapes a voice. What's scarce is the Millets, not the audience. Millet's sour sat in Van Gogh's mind for 7 years before it became his own painting. That incubation, the slow, unconscious absorption of an influence until it transforms into something original, requires time and repetition. The pace at which creative work is now produced and consumed leaves almost no room for that process. Van Gogh wrote from the asylum that the process of working from Millet was closer to translation than copying, carrying something into another language, the language of colors, improvising from black and white. He needed one artist, one set of prints, and 15 years of returning to them to find a voice that nobody else in history has managed to replicate. The impulse now is to look at everything, every reference, every movement, every contemporary working in your field, and call that research. Van Gogh did the opposite. He narrowed. He went back. He let one person's vision press against his own until something original appeared at the point of resistance. Van Gogh's relationship with Millet shows that imitation, real, sustained, deliberate imitation, is one of the oldest and most reliable paths to an original voice. The imitation is the training. The voice emerges through it, shaped by the resistance of working inside someone else's structure until it becomes your own. Think about the work you make, or want to make, or have made. Then think about whose work sits in you the way Millet sat in Van Gogh, as something you've returned to enough times that it has changed the way you see. If the answer comes slowly, that's the argument. Van Gogh had 21 black and white prints of one painter. From those, he built a language. Most people making creative work now have access to more references in an afternoon than Van Gogh encountered in a decade, and struggle to say who has genuinely pressed against them, who left a mark deep enough to change the work. Art doesn't only produce objects, it produces the conditions under which people form themselves. When there is enough serious artistic work in the world, people can be shaped by it the way Van Gogh was shaped by Millet. When that pool shrinks far enough, what's left is a world built for consuming and surviving, with less and less room for the other thing. In 1890, the year Van Gogh died, Millet's The Angelus sold at auction for 750,000 francs, a record price at the time, driven in part by the renewed attention Van Gogh's translations had brought to the older painter's work. The students' sustained devotion had made the teacher famous again, 15 years after his death. Van Gogh found his voice by going back to the same source, again and again, for 15 years. The dare his story leaves behind is simple enough. Pick one work, one writer, one painter, one musician who has genuinely shaped what you make, and go back to it now. Van Gogh copied Millet from black and white prints in an asylum room, without the original colors, without the paintings themselves, with only the structure to work from. What he added was entirely his own. The voice was always his. Millet just gave him something solid enough to push against until it appeared.
Thank you for watching. If this video brought you any value, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. For more content like this, hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you next time.